The morning of my granddaughter's christening, I stood in the church vestibule in a mustard yellow dress, 2 sizes too big, smoothing down fabric that would never lie flat, and I thought, she did this on purpose. A woman does not spend 40 years arranging flowers for a living, and then accidentally order the wrong dress for her own mother. Not when she'd ordered everyone else's correctly. Not when she'd had 3 months to get it right. My name is Eleanor. No, my name is Caroline. I'm 56 years old. I raised 2 daughters mostly on my own. After my husband decided 48 was a fine age to discover he wanted a different life. And I built a small accounting practice out of our spare bedroom that eventually paid for both girls' university tuition. I tell you that not to brag, but so you understand something. I am not a woman who imagines slights where none exist. I have spent my whole life being practical, being the one who balances the books, who reads the fine print, who notices things. So when I tell you my daughter Whitney planned this, I need you to know I'm not guessing. I have the receipts. Literally. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which wasn't the dress at all. Whitney is my older daughter, 4 years older than her sister, and from the moment she could talk she had a gift for making her needs sound like emergencies. My younger daughter, Pippa, learned early to step back, to wait her turn, to be the easy one. I want to be fair to myself here. I didn't mean to let it happen. Their father, Graham, used to say Whitney just had more presence. Like that explained why she got the bigger bedroom, the piano lessons, the trip to Europe for her 18th birthday, while Pippa's 18th birthday got a nice dinner at the Keg and a card. I told myself I was being equitable in spirit even when I wasn't being equitable in practice. Parents do that. We tell ourselves stories so we can sleep at night. By the time the girls were grown, the pattern was set in concrete. Whitney called and I dropped things. Pippa called and I told her I'd phone her back. I'm not proud of that. I've had a lot of years and a lot of quiet car rides to sit with how unfair that was. How it must have felt from the inside. Always being the one who didn't quite warrant urgency. Whitney met Desmond about 3 years ago. He's an actuary, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order after one visit. I liked him immediately, and frankly I liked him more than I sometimes liked my own daughter. Which is an uncomfortable thing to admit about your child, but there it is. When they had their daughter, little Margot, I cried in the hospital parking lot from sheer joy. I drove 3 hours every second weekend that first year just to help. I never once asked for thanks. So when Whitney called to ask if I would stand up at the christening, not as a godmother, she already had a godmother picked, her best friend from nursing school, but as what she called, the honored grandmother, with a specific role in the ceremony and a dress code to match everyone else in the immediate family party. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. Margot is my granddaughter. The color scheme, she told me over coffee at her kitchen table in Mississauga, was going to be sage green, soft, elegant, very on trend for a fall christening, she said, scrolling through photos on her phone of women in flowing sage-colored dresses, fitted through the bodice, gentle movement at the hem. She'd already measured everyone. Desmond's mother, her sister-in-law, her 2 closest friends who'd be standing with the family. She had my measurements from a wedding 2 years back. She said she'd handle everything, the ordering, the alterations, all of it. I told her that was very organized of her. I meant it as a compliment. I didn't know yet what organization could be used for. The first crack showed up at the family dinner the week before. Whitney had everyone over. Desmond's parents, her in-laws, a few cousins, and she'd printed little place cards, the kind with calligraphy, for the head table. There were 6 cards. Mine wasn't among them. I found my name written in regular pen, not calligraphy, taped to a folding chair near the kitchen doorway, next to Desmond's elderly uncle who was hard of hearing and spent the meals asking me to repeat myself. I told myself it was an oversight. People get overwhelmed planning these things. Then Whitney stood up partway through dinner to thank everyone for their support during this beautiful chapter. She thanked Desmond's mother by name for the bassinet. She thanked her best friend, the godmother, for agreeing to such an important role. She thanked her 2 friends who were standing with the family. Then she said, and obviously my family, with a small wave toward the kitchen doorway, toward the folding chair, toward me, no name. I sat very still and ate my dinner, and told myself I was tired, that I was reading into things, the way my mother used to tell me I was too sensitive when I was a girl, and wasn't it interesting how I'd absorbed that same line and was now handing it to myself. The morning of the christening, we were all meant to get dressed together at Whitney's house, before driving to the church. I arrived at 9, exactly when she'd asked. The other women were already there, already in their robes, already laughing over coffee in the kitchen. And there were 5 sage green dresses hanging on a rod by the bay window, beautiful things. The fabric catching the morning light. I didn't see a 6th. Whitney was at the mirror doing her own makeup, and when I asked where mine was, she didn't even turn around right away. "Oh," she said, like she'd genuinely forgotten I existed in this particular configuration of the morning. "Yours is in the garment bag by the stairs." It wasn't hanging. It was folded into a bag on the floor, the way you'd store off-season clothes in a closet. I unzipped it. Mustard yellow. Not a soft gold, not a warm neutral that might have at least photographed well next to sage. An aggressive, traffic cone-adjacent mustard. The kind of color you'd choose specifically because it clashes with everything around it. And the tag inside said size 18. I have worn a size 10 my entire adult life. And Whitney knows that better than anyone. Because she's the one who used to borrow my clothes in university. The kitchen went quiet for that particular half-second, where everyone notices something. And nobody knows whose job it is to say it out loud. "Whitney," I said, very calmly, because I have spent 56 years learning how to be calm in rooms that wanted me to be otherwise. "What is this?" She glanced over, brush still in hand. "Oh, that. The boutique was out of your size in sage. This was all they had left in time, out of my size, but you found a different color entirely. In a size 8 bigger than I wear?" She shrugged, one shoulder, the exact gesture she'd had since she was 12 years old and didn't want to answer a question. "It was last minute, Mom. I did my best." One of the other women, Desmond's sister-in-law, a kind woman named Priya, who I'd met only twice, looked at me with an expression that said she understood exactly what was happening and had absolutely no intention of saying so out loud. I didn't blame her. Nobody wants to be the one who points at the emperor's new clothes at a christening. I want to tell you what went through my mind in that moment, because I think it matters. I thought about Whitney as a little girl, 4 years old, refusing to share her crayons with her baby sister, and how I'd laughed it off as a phase. I thought about every Christmas where her gift got opened first, and unwrapped slowest, savored, while Pippa's gifts got rushed through. I thought about how I had spent 5 decades training one daughter to believe she was the center of every room. And now I was standing in her kitchen, holding a dress in a color that didn't exist in nature, wondering how I'd gotten here. And then I made a decision. Not a loud one, the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your chest like a key, turning in a lock you didn't know was unlocked. I was going to put on the dress. I was going to stand at that church exactly where she'd asked me to stand. I was going to smile for every photograph, and then I was going to let whatever happened next happen entirely on its own. Because I have learned something in 56 years that I wish someone had told me at 25. The truth does not require your assistance. It only requires your patience. I put on the mustard dress. It hung off me like a sail with no wind. I found a scarf in my purse and cinched it at the waist, which didn't make it look good, exactly. But at least made it look like a choice rather than an accident. I did my own hair in the bathroom mirror with the door closed. Because I needed 2 minutes alone. And I will admit that cried, briefly, quietly, the way you learn to cry when you've spent a lifetime not wanting to be a burden. Then I wiped my face, reapplied my lipstick, and walked back out into that kitchen with my chin up. Here is something I hadn't told anyone yet, something I'd learned 2 weeks earlier, and had been carrying around like a stone in my coat pocket. I'd run into Desmond's mother, a woman named Joanne, at a fabric store in Oakville. We'd gotten along well at every family gathering, the kind of warm, plain-spoken friendship that develops between two mothers who've both raised difficult, wonderful children. Joanne mentioned she'd helped Whitney coordinate with the boutique because Whitney had been overwhelmed with the seating chart and the catering. Almost as an aside, she said, "I noticed your order was listed differently than the rest of ours. Different style code, different size category entirely. I assumed you'd requested something custom." I told her I hadn't requested anything. She went quiet for a second, The way people do when they realize they've said something they weren't supposed to. I just assumed, she said again, but more carefully this time. I'd gone home that night and pulled up the email confirmation Whitney had forwarded me weeks earlier. The one I'd barely glanced at because I trusted her. There it was in black and white, 5 dresses, same style number, same color code, correct sizes, and a 6th line item ordered 9 days after the others, different style number entirely, a different vendor SKU, not a shortage, not a mistake, a separate, deliberate order. I hadn't said a word to anyone about it. I'd folded the printout and put it in the drawer of my nightstand and gone about my week, because I wanted to see what she would do with the opportunity I was, without meaning to, about to give her. The church service itself was lovely, I'll say that honestly, because fairness matters to me even now. The light came through the stained glass. Exactly the way you'd want it to for photographs. Margot wore a tiny white gown that had been in Desmond's family for 3 generations. And when the priest poured the water over her head and she let out one indignant little cry, the whole congregation laughed softly. And Desmond cried real tears. The kind you cannot perform for a camera. I stood at the front with the family party. The only woman in mustard yellow surrounded by 5 women in sage green. And I felt every eye in that church find me and then politely look away. Some people stared longer than was polite. An elderly cousin of Desmond's actually leaned over to her husband and whispered something I couldn't hear, but could absolutely read on her face. I kept my back straight and my hands folded, and I did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching me shrink, because I had decided, somewhere around the 3rd decade of my life, that shrinking was a habit I was finished with. During the reception, which Whitney had booked at a banquet hall out near the lakeshore, 3 different people found a polite way to ask me what had happened with my dress. I gave each of them the same answer. You'd have to ask Whitney about that, nothing more. I wasn't going to do her explaining for her. It was during the cake cutting that Joanne found me at my table. She'd clearly been turning something over in her mind all afternoon, because she sat down across from me without any preamble and said quietly, "Caroline, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Did Whitney do this on purpose?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," I said. "I have the email to prove it if you'd like to see it." Joanne's jaw tightened in a way that told me she believed me before she'd seen a single piece of paper. "I'm going to talk to Desmond," she said. I didn't ask her to. I want to be clear about that. Because afterward, in the family group chat, there were accusations flying around that I had recruited Joanne. That I had turned my own granddaughter's christening into a production. I hadn't asked Joanne for anything. I had simply, finally after 56 years, stopped covering for my daughter's worst instincts, and it turned out that other people, once they had the facts, were perfectly capable of drawing their own conclusions. I watched from across the room. Joanne approached Desmond near the gift table. I watched his face change. I watched him glance over at me, then at Whitney, then back at me, and something in his posture shifted from relaxed to careful. He didn't come to me at the reception. He was, after all, the host's husband, and there was a room full of guests to manage. But he found me 3 days later, alone, when he stopped by my house to drop off a framed photo from the christening. "Caroline," he said, standing in my front hallway still in his coat, "I need to ask you something. Did Whitney order that dress for you on purpose? The wrong size, the wrong color?" I held his gaze. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a second. "I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve that. Margot's first day in the church and you had to stand there like that." "I know," I said. "But I appreciate you asking me directly instead of letting it sit." He left not long after, and I want to tell you something about that conversation that surprised me. I felt no satisfaction in it. None. I had spent 30 years of my marriage being the one who absorbed things quietly so the peace could be kept. And there was no triumph in finally being believed. There was only a tired kind of relief the way you feel after putting down something heavy you've been carrying so long. You forgot your shoulders could ache from something else. My ex-husband Graham called me that week too. He'd heard about it from Pippa, who'd heard about it from Joanne's daughter, the way news travels through a family like water, finding every low point in a floor. Graham and I haven't spoken much beyond logistics in the 8 years since the divorce, but he sounded genuinely shaken on the phone. "Whitney did that to you? On purpose?" he asked. And I told him yes, and gave him the short version. And there was a long silence on his end before he said, I always wondered why she got away with so much. I think I know now. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd heard out of that man in a decade. And I took it for what it was worth. What I hadn't expected, what came from a direction I never could have engineered, was the photographer. Whitney had hired a young woman named Astrid, recommended by a coworker, who specialized in family events and ran a modest but well-followed photography page online. About 2 weeks after the christening, Astrid posted a short reflection alongside one of the candid shots from the ceremony, me standing at the front of the church, the only person not in sage, face composed, hands folded, surrounded by color I clearly didn't belong in. She hadn't named anyone. She didn't have to. The caption said something about how the most honest photograph at any family event is rarely the one that was planned, and how she'd watched a grandmother stand with more dignity in a mismatched dress than anyone else in the room, standing in coordinated silk. It spread further than I would have guessed, the way these things sometimes do in small world Ontario social media circles. Friends of friends of friends. People started asking questions in the comments. Someone found Whitney's own post from months earlier where she'd written about wanting her christening to look effortlessly cohesive, which read very differently once people had seen the photograph. I never engaged with any of it online. My daughter Pippa called to tell me it was happening, and I told her I appreciated her telling me. And then I closed my laptop and went and watered my garden. Because there are some things you don't need to watch unfold in real time to know how they'll end. Whitney called me 3 days after that, furious, certain I had orchestrated the whole thing, certain I had spoken to Astrid, certain this was some calculated humiliation I'd engineered against her on her own daughter's christening day. I let her finish. Then I said, Whitney, I wore the dress you sent me. I stood where you asked me to stand. I smiled for every photograph. I never said one unkind word to a single guest. The only person who created what happened that day was you, and I think some part of you has always known that, and I think that's exactly why you're so angry right now. She hung up on me. My instinct, even after everything, was to call her back and smooth it over, the way I'd been doing for 30 years. I didn't. I sat with my phone in my hand and I let the silence be what it was, instead of rushing to fill it the way I always had. It was Pippa, of all people, who called me that evening, and what she said undid me more than anything that had happened all week. Mom, she said, I've watched you apologize for things that weren't your fault my whole life. I didn't think you had it in you to just let something stand. I didn't have a clever answer for that. I just cried, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes after you've finally put something down. My mother, my own mother, who is 81 and lives in a retirement community outside Burlington, and has never in her life minced a word, called me the following week. She'd heard the story secondhand from my sister. Caroline, she said, you should have thrown that dress in the lake. I thought about it, I told her, and I meant it. It's been 4 months now. Whitney and I haven't spoken since that phone call. Beyond 2 clipped texts about a pediatrician appointment. She needed me to confirm I could make for Margot, which I did. Because whatever is broken between Whitney and me, it has nothing to do with my granddaughter, and I will not let it. I don't know what their marriage looks like behind closed doors these days, whether Desmond has said more to her, or whether he's letting it settle on its own. That's not mine to know. And at 56, I've finally learned the difference between curiosity and entitlement to other people's private weather. What I know is this. I didn't scheme. I didn't plan some dramatic confrontation at the reception, didn't pull her aside and make a scene, didn't post a single word online. I put on a mustard yellow dress that didn't fit me, in a color my daughter chose specifically. Because she knew exactly how it would look against 5 women in sage, and I let the truth of what she'd done settle onto the ground, exactly where it belonged. I didn't carry it for her. I am done carrying things for her. I spent 56 years carrying things for people who never once asked whether my shoulders were tired. The dress is still hanging in the back of my closet. I haven't given it away. And I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because some days I want the reminder. Most days, when I see that ugly flash of yellow between my good coats, I don't feel the sting anymore. I feel something steadier than that. Something that feels a great deal like being finished. I'm finished making myself smaller in rooms I have every right to take up space in. I'm finished believing that motherhood means absorbing whatever your children decide to hand you, even when they're 50 years old and you're the one who still shows up every single time. That isn't love. That's just exhaustion wearing love's coat. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, if you have ever stood somewhere in the wrong color, the wrong size, the wrong seat at someone else's table, while everyone around you pretended not to notice, I want you to hear this from a woman who has lived long enough to know it for certain. The fact that someone you love chose to humiliate you says nothing about your worth. It only ever says something about what they couldn't bear to see clearly in themselves.